Sarah Martinez had always preferred the quiet life. After 12 years of serving her country as a Navy SEAL, the small coastal town of Millbrook offered exactly what she needed: peace, anonymity, and the gentle sound of waves instead of gunfire. Her modest two-story house sat at the end of Maple Street, surrounded by a well-maintained garden that she tended with the same precision she once applied to military operations. The neighbors knew very little about the woman who had moved in 3 months ago. She was polite but distant, always offering a friendly wave when she collected her mail or worked in her garden. Sarah kept her past carefully locked away, telling anyone who asked that she was a retired consultant who worked from home. The truth was far more complex, but she had learned long ago that most people weren't ready to hear about the battles she had fought in places whose names they couldn't pronounce. Her daily routine was simple and structured. Every morning at 5:30, she would go for a run along the coastal path, her breathing steady and controlled as she covered the same 6-mile route. The townspeople who were early risers would see her pass by, always at the same time, always maintaining the same pace. After her run, she would return home for a shower, then spend her morning tending to her vegetables and flowers. The precision with which she maintained her garden would have impressed her former commanding officers. Sarah had chosen Millbrook specifically because it was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. The most exciting event in recent memory had been when Mrs. Henderson's cat got stuck in a tree, requiring the volunteer fire department to mount a rescue mission that became the talk of the town for weeks. It was exactly the kind of peaceful existence Sarah had dreamed about during those long nights in hostile territory, when the weight of her gear and the responsibility for her team's safety kept sleep at bay. The house itself reflected her practical nature. The interior was clean and minimalist, with functional furniture and very few personal decorations. What visitors couldn't see were the subtle security measures she had installed: reinforced door frames, high-quality locks, and a security system that would make most homeowners jealous. Old habits died hard, and Sarah had learned that being prepared was always better than being caught off guard. Her neighbors, the Johnsons, had tried several times to invite her to neighborhood barbecues and social gatherings. Sarah always politely declined, claiming she had work commitments or other obligations. The truth was that she wasn't ready for the questions that inevitably came with social interaction. How do you explain to suburban families that you've spent years in places where survival depended on split-second decisions and absolute trust in your teammates? The local grocery store had become her primary point of contact with the community. Every Tuesday and Friday, she would drive her reliable Honda Civic to Miller's Market, where she would purchase exactly what she needed for the week. The teenage cashiers found her somewhat mysterious. She was always friendly but never chatty, always paid in cash, and seemed to have an unusual awareness of her surroundings that they couldn't quite place. One particularly quiet Thursday afternoon, Sarah was in her backyard pruning her rose bushes when she noticed an unusual amount of activity at the empty house across the street. The old Victorian had been vacant for almost a year since Mr. Peterson passed away, and his family had been trying to sell it without success. Now there were several large trucks parked outside, and men in civilian clothes were unloading boxes and equipment with military precision. From her position behind the rose bushes, Sarah observed the operation with trained eyes. The men moved with purpose and coordination that spoke of military training. Their casual clothes couldn't disguise the way they carried themselves: shoulders back, alert postures, and the kind of situational awareness that came from years of service. As she watched, she counted at least 15 individuals, all appearing to be in excellent physical condition and working together with the efficiency of a well-drilled unit. The arrival of these men created an immediate stir in the normally peaceful neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson, from 2 houses down, had already positioned herself at her front window with a pair of binoculars, while the Johnsons were having an animated discussion on their front porch. Sarah could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the afternoon breeze, speculation about who these men were and what they were doing in their quiet community. As the afternoon progressed, the activity across the street intensified. More vehicles arrived, including several large SUVs and what appeared to be a communications van. The men continued their work with mechanical efficiency, but Sarah noticed they were also conducting what looked like security sweeps of the property and surrounding area. This wasn't a normal moving operation, this was something else entirely. By evening, the trucks had departed, but the SUVs remained parked strategically around the property. Lights were on throughout the house, and Sarah could occasionally see figures moving past the windows. Whatever was happening across the street, it was clear that these weren't ordinary new neighbors. The question was whether they were friend or foe, and Sarah's instincts were telling her to be prepared for either possibility. That night, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She positioned herself at her bedroom window, which offered a clear view of the house across the street. The training that had kept her alive in combat zones was now screaming that something wasn't right. The men's behavior, the equipment she had glimpsed, and the way they had secured the property all pointed to some kind of military or paramilitary operation. Around midnight, she observed something that confirmed her suspicions. Two men emerged from the house carrying what appeared to be surveillance equipment, which they proceeded to install at strategic points around the property. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. These men were settling in for what looked like an extended operation. The question that kept Sarah awake was simple. What were they watching, and did it have anything to do with her? The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. The men across the street had maintained a low profile, but Sarah's trained eye could spot the subtle signs of their presence. Curtains that moved when no one should be there, the slight adjustment of parked vehicles to provide better sight lines, and the careful way they managed foot traffic around the property. These weren't ordinary residents. They were operators conducting some kind of surveillance mission. As Sarah went about her normal routine, she became acutely aware that she was being watched. The feeling was familiar from her military days, the particular tension that came from knowing hostile eyes were tracking your movements. During her morning run, she noticed a vehicle that seemed to be pacing her route at a distance. When she stopped at the market, she spotted one of the men from across the street making purchases he clearly didn't need while keeping her in sight. The situation escalated when Sarah returned home to find evidence that someone had attempted to access her property. The subtle security measures she had put in place showed clear signs of probing. Someone had tested her locks, examined her windows, and even attempted to access her wireless network. They had been careful, but not careful enough to fool someone with her background in training. That evening, as Sarah sat in her kitchen planning her next move, she noticed increased activity across the street. More men had arrived, and there was an urgent quality to their movements that suggested something was about to happen. Whatever operation they were running, it was entering a new phase, and Sarah was becoming increasingly certain that she was the target. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Somehow, her carefully constructed new life had been compromised. Someone had discovered her true identity and her location. And now, a team of unknown operatives was conducting what appeared to be a preliminary assessment before taking some kind of action. The question was whether they were government agents, foreign operatives, or something else entirely. As night fell over the quiet neighborhood of Millbrook, Sarah began to prepare for the possibility that her peaceful retirement was about to come to an abrupt end. The skills and instincts that had kept her alive in the world's most dangerous places were awakening from their dormant state, and she found herself conducting mental inventories of her resources and possible escape routes. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come to this small town to escape from conflict, only to find that conflict had followed her home. But Sarah Martinez hadn't survived 12 years as a Navy SEAL by backing down from a fight, and she wasn't about to start now. Whatever these men wanted, they were about to discover that the quiet woman across the street was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter the peaceful facade of Maple Street and remind everyone involved that some warriors never truly retire. They just wait for the next battle to find them. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Sarah heard the vehicles approaching. From her position at the kitchen window, she watched as 3 black SUVs rolled down Maple Street with the kind of coordinated precision that made her blood run cold. This wasn't a casual visit. This was a tactical deployment, and she was clearly the objective. The 15 soldiers who emerged from the vehicles moved with military discipline, but there was something casual about their approach that told Sarah they had underestimated their target. They were confident, perhaps overconfident, in their assessment of the situation. As they gathered on her front lawn, she could see they were all young, probably recent veterans themselves, fit and well-trained but lacking the hard-won experience that only came from real combat. The leader of the group, a tall man with sergeant's stripes still visible on his tactical vest, approached her front door with the swagger of someone who expected easy compliance. When Sarah opened the door before he could knock, she saw a moment of surprise flash across his face. He had clearly expected to be dealing with a frightened civilian, not someone who met his gaze with the calm confidence of a professional warrior. "Ma'am," the sergeant began, his voice carrying the authority he was accustomed to having respected without question. "I'm Sergeant Danny Rodriguez, United States Army. We're conducting a training exercise in this area, and we need to requisition your property for the next 72 hours. You'll need to pack a bag and relocate temporarily. The government will compensate you for any inconvenience." Sarah studied the 15 men arrayed behind their leader, noting their positions, equipment, and the casual way they held their weapons. They were good soldiers, she could see that much, but they were operating under assumptions that were about to prove costly. The fact that they thought they could simply walk onto her property and take control showed they had no idea who they were dealing with. "That's an interesting request, Sergeant," Sarah replied, her voice calm and measured. "Do you have paperwork authorizing this requisition? Search warrants? Legal documentation of any kind?" She could see the momentary confusion in Rodriguez's eyes. He clearly hadn't expected to be questioned about legal procedures. "Ma'am, this is a matter of national security," Rodriguez responded, falling back on the authority that had always worked for him in the past. "We don't have time for bureaucratic procedures. You need to comply with our request immediately, or we'll be forced to take other measures." Behind Rodriguez, several of his men shifted uncomfortably. They could sense something in Sarah's demeanor that their sergeant was missing, the particular stillness that came from someone who had faced real danger and survived. But Rodriguez, confident in his numerical advantage and official authority, pressed forward with his demands. "I understand you believe this is a matter of national security," Sarah said, stepping fully outside and closing the door behind her. The movement was casual, but it positioned her in a way that gave her multiple escape routes while keeping the entire group in her field of vision. "But this is my property, and I'm not going anywhere without proper legal authorization." The standoff that followed was filled with tension as Rodriguez and his team realized they were dealing with someone who wouldn't be intimidated by uniforms and official-sounding demands. Sarah could see them beginning to reassess the situation, noting details about her posture and bearing that should have been obvious from the beginning. "Ma'am," one of the younger soldiers spoke up, his voice uncertain, "we really do need this property for our training exercise. It's the perfect location for what we need to accomplish, and Command has specifically designated this address." Sarah turned her attention to the young soldier, recognizing something familiar in his bearing. "What's your name, soldier?" "Private First Class Jake Morrison, ma'am," he replied, straightening unconsciously under her gaze. "Where did you serve, Morrison?" Sarah asked, her tone taking on the quality of a senior non-commissioned officer addressing a subordinate. "Afghanistan, ma'am. 2 tours with the 82nd Airborne." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Good unit. I'm sure they taught you about respecting civilian authority and following proper procedures when operating on American soil." The subtle reminder of legal boundaries wasn't lost on Morrison, who glanced nervously at his sergeant. Rodriguez, sensing he was losing control of the situation, decided to escalate. "That's enough questions, ma'am. You're going to pack your things and leave, or we're going to remove you from the premises. This is your final warning." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Around the neighborhood, Sarah could see curtains twitching as residents watched the drama unfold on the normally peaceful street. Mrs. Henderson had abandoned all pretense and was standing openly in her front yard with a phone in her hand, clearly debating whether to call the police. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone that every military person recognized instinctively, the voice of someone with real authority. "I'm going to give you and your men one opportunity to reconsider your approach. I suggest you take it." Something in her tone finally penetrated Rodriguez's confidence. For the first time since arriving, he began to really look at the woman standing before him. He noticed the way she held herself, the controlled breathing, the positioning that kept her balanced and ready to move in any direction. Most importantly, he noticed that she wasn't afraid, not even slightly. "Ma'am, we have our orders," Rodriguez said, but some of the certainty had gone out of his voice. "I'm sure you do," Sarah replied. but I'm betting those orders didn't include a full briefing on who lives at this address. She let that sink in for a moment before continuing. Tell me, Sergeant, what exactly did your commanding officer tell you about the resident of this property? The question hit its mark. Rodriguez's expression shifted as he began to realize that perhaps their intelligence briefing had been incomplete. Behind him, several of his more experienced team members were beginning to pick up on the subtle signs that their sergeant was missing. They said you were a former military consultant, Rodriguez admitted, his voice less certain than it had been moments before. Sarah nodded slowly. That's technically accurate, but it's not the whole story. She took a step forward, noting how several of the soldiers instinctively adjusted their positions in response to her movement. The question you should be asking yourselves is why a simple training exercise would require 15 men to evict one civilian woman from her home. The implications of her words were beginning to register with the more perceptive members of the team. If this was really just about clearing a civilian for a training exercise, why the overwhelming show of force? Why the careful surveillance that had preceded their arrival? And why was their target displaying the kind of calm confidence that only came from extensive combat experience? Ma'am? Private Morrison spoke up again, his voice respectful but troubled. Are you saying our briefing was incomplete? I'm saying, Morrison, that your commanding officer may have sent you into a situation you're not prepared for, Sarah replied. She could see understanding beginning to dawn on several faces, though Rodriguez was still clinging to his original assumptions. Sergeant Rodriguez, feeling his authority challenged and his mission questioned, made the decision that would transform this from a bureaucratic dispute into something far more serious. Enough talking, he declared, gesturing to two of his men. Jenkins, Murphy, escort the lady off her property. Use minimum force, but get her out of here. The two soldiers he had designated, both experienced corporals, hesitated. Something about the situation didn't feel right to them, and their combat experience was telling them to be more careful. But military discipline was a powerful force, and they began to move toward Sarah with obvious reluctance. Sarah watched them approach with the calm assessment of a professional evaluating a tactical situation. She could see that neither man really wanted to put hands on her, and their body language suggested they were hoping she would simply comply and avoid forcing a physical confrontation. Unfortunately for everyone involved, compliance wasn't an option she was prepared to consider. Gentlemen, she said calmly, I'm going to give you the same advice I gave your sergeant. This would be an excellent time to reconsider your approach. Her words were reasonable, but there was something in her tone that made both soldiers pause mid-step. Corporal Jenkins, the older of the two, had served in Iraq and Afghanistan and had developed the kind of situational awareness that kept soldiers alive in hostile environments. Something about this woman was setting off every alarm bell in his head, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Ma'am, Jenkins said carefully, we don't want any trouble. If you'll just cooperate with us, this doesn't have to get complicated. I appreciate that, Corporal, Sarah replied, but cooperation requires legitimate authority, and you haven't demonstrated any. What you have demonstrated is that 15 armed men think they can intimidate one woman into abandoning her legal rights. The words hung in the air as the full reality of the situation began to settle over everyone present. This wasn't going to be the simple civilian relocation they had been told to expect. The woman standing before them had military bearing, extensive training, and absolutely no intention of backing down from a fight. Rodriguez, sensing that he was rapidly losing control of his mission, made his final mistake. That's it, he barked. All units, take positions. We're going to secure this property and remove the occupant by whatever means necessary. As 15 soldiers began to deploy into tactical positions around her property, Sarah Martinez felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had carried her through countless dangerous situations. The peace and quiet she had sought in Millbrook was officially over, and the warrior she had tried to retire was about to remind everyone present why Navy SEALs were considered the elite of the elite. The battle for Maple Street was about to begin, and these soldiers were about to learn that their numerical advantage meant nothing when facing an opponent who had been forged in conflicts they could barely imagine. What happened next unfolded with the brutal efficiency that only comes from years of training under the most extreme conditions imaginable. As the 15 soldiers moved to surround her property, Sarah Martinez transformed from a quiet suburban neighbor into the weapon of precision she had been trained to be. The first indication that Rodriguez and his team had made a catastrophic error came when Sarah simply disappeared. One moment she was standing on her front porch facing down their overwhelming numbers, and the next moment she had vanished into thin air. The soldiers found themselves staring at empty space, their careful deployment suddenly rendered meaningless by the absence of their target. "Where did she go?" Rodriguez demanded, his voice carrying the first notes of genuine concern as he scanned the property with growing alarm. The answer came from an unexpected direction. Sarah had used the momentary confusion of their deployment to slip around the side of her house, moving with the silent precision that had made her legendary among her SEAL teammates. Her first objective was to even the odds, and she had identified the perfect opportunity to do so. 2 soldiers had been positioned to cover the rear of the property, confident in their tactical superiority and unaware that they were dealing with someone who had spent years perfecting the art of asymmetric warfare. Sarah approached them from their blind spot, using the landscaping she had carefully maintained to provide concealment and cover. Corporal Jenkins never knew what hit him. One moment he was scanning the backyard through his rifle scope, and the next he found himself face down on the lawn with his weapon expertly removed and his hands zip-tied behind his back with the plastic restraints from his own gear. His partner, Corporal Murphy, managed to turn around just in time to see Sarah moving toward him with fluid grace that spoke of countless hours of combat training. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Sarah said quietly, and something in her voice convinced Murphy that resistance would be futile and potentially dangerous to his health. Within minutes, Sarah had neutralized 2 soldiers and acquired their weapons and equipment. More importantly, she had demonstrated to the remaining 13 that they were not dealing with an ordinary civilian. The sound of their teammates being taken down with professional efficiency sent a shockwave through the group that fundamentally altered their understanding of the situation. Rodriguez, realizing that his carefully planned operation was rapidly descending into chaos, attempted to regain control through superior firepower and coordination. "All units, converge on the backyard. Subject is armed and extremely dangerous." But Sarah had already anticipated this response, and was no longer where Rodriguez expected her to be. Using the techniques that had kept her alive in hostile territory from Afghanistan to Somalia, she had repositioned herself to take advantage of the terrain and the soldiers' predictable reactions to their changing circumstances. The next phase of the engagement demonstrated why Navy SEALs were considered the premier special operations force in the world. Sarah used her intimate knowledge of her own property, combined with years of experience in urban warfare, to turn her suburban home into a tactical nightmare for the attacking force. Private Morrison, following his sergeant's orders to advance on the backyard, found himself suddenly alone as his teammates seemed to vanish one by one. The eerie silence was broken only by the occasional sound of equipment hitting the ground and the quiet voices of his fellow soldiers calling out their surrender. "This isn't what we signed up for," Morrison muttered to himself as he realized that half his team had been neutralized by a single opponent who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The turning point came when Sergeant Rodriguez, frustrated by his inability to locate and engage his target, made the tactical error of exposing himself while attempting to coordinate his remaining forces. Sarah had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, and she seized it with the ruthless efficiency that had made her one of the most feared operatives in the special operations community. Rodriguez found himself looking down the barrel of his own sidearm, which had somehow ended up in Sarah's hands while his rifle lay uselessly 10 feet away. The speed and precision of her movement had been so complete that he hadn't even realized he was disarmed until it was too late to react. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said calmly, "I believe it's time for you and your remaining men to reconsider your approach to this situation. The psychological impact of seeing their leader completely neutralized by their target was devastating to the morale of the remaining soldiers. They had been trained to follow orders and maintain discipline under fire, but nothing in their training had prepared them for facing an opponent who operated at this level of tactical sophistication. As the reality of their situation sank in, the remaining soldiers began to understand that they were completely outmatched. This wasn't a training exercise or a routine operation. They had unknowingly engaged an operator whose skills and experience far exceeded their own. "Who are you?" Rodriguez asked, his voice barely above a whisper as the full implications of his mistake became clear. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she replied, maintaining her tactical advantage while speaking in the calm, professional tone of someone completely in control of the situation. "Master Chief Petty Officer, retired, United States Navy SEALs, 12 years of active duty, including multiple deployments to every major combat zone you can imagine." The revelation hit the remaining soldiers like a physical blow. They had been sent to intimidate and relocate a retired Navy SEAL, one of the most elite warriors in the American military. The absurdity of their mission was now obvious to everyone present, including Sergeant Rodriguez, whose face had gone pale as he realized the magnitude of his error. "The question now," Sarah continued, "is what we're going to do about this situation. You came here under orders, following what you believed were legitimate instructions, but those instructions were based on incomplete or deliberately misleading information about who you were dealing with. Around the neighborhood, the residents of Maple Street were witnessing something unprecedented. Mrs. Henderson had called the police, but the local officers were reluctant to intervene in what appeared to be a military operation. The Johnson family had barricaded themselves in their house, while other neighbors watched from behind curtains as their quiet street became the scene of a tactical engagement. "Master Chief," Private Morrison called out, his voice carrying the respect that her rank and reputation commanded. "We were told this was a routine training exercise. Nobody said anything about engaging someone with your background and experience." Sarah nodded, recognizing the sincerity in the young soldier's voice. "I believe that, Morrison. The question is why your commanding officer would send you on this mission without proper intelligence about the target. That suggests either gross incompetence or deliberate deception." The implications of her words were not lost on the assembled soldiers. If their mission briefing had been deliberately incomplete, it raised serious questions about the legitimacy of their orders and the motivations of whoever had sent them. As the immediate tactical situation stabilized, Sarah began to piece together the larger picture of what had brought these soldiers to her doorstep. The surveillance, the overwhelming show of force, and the insistence on immediate compliance all pointed to someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. "Sergeant," Sarah said, "I need you to contact your commanding officer and inform them that the situation has changed significantly. Tell them that Master Chief Martinez requests an immediate conference to discuss the objectives and authorization for this operation." Rodriguez, still struggling to process the complete reversal of his tactical situation, reached for his communication equipment with hands that trembled slightly. The conversation that followed would be one that he would remember for the rest of his military career. "Command, this is Rodriguez," he said into his radio. "We have a situation here. The subject has been positively identified as a retired Navy SEAL Master Chief. Repeat, we are dealing with a Navy SEAL veteran with extensive combat experience." The silence from the other end of the radio was telling. When the response finally came, it was clear that someone had expected this outcome, which raised even more disturbing questions about the true nature of this operation. "Copy that, Rodriguez. Maintain your position and await further instructions." Sarah, who had been monitoring the communication, immediately recognized the significance of the response. "Interesting," she observed. "Your commanding officer doesn't sound surprised by this development. In fact, they sound like they were expecting it." The realization that they had been deliberately sent into an impossible situation against a vastly superior opponent began to sink in among the soldiers. They had been used as pawns in some larger game, sent to face an elite warrior without proper preparation or support. As the afternoon sun began to set over Maple Street, the standoff entered a new phase. Sarah had successfully defended her property and neutralized the immediate threat, but the larger questions remained unanswered. Who had sent these soldiers? What was their real objective? And why had someone gone to such elaborate lengths to orchestrate this confrontation? The answers would come eventually, but for now, 15 humbled soldiers were learning a hard lesson about respecting both their opponents and the chain of command that had led them into this situation. They had come to Millbrook expecting to intimidate a civilian, but instead they had encountered a warrior whose legend was about to grow even larger. In the quiet suburbs of a small coastal town, Master Chief Sarah Martinez had proven once again that retirement from the Navy SEALs meant never being truly off-duty. The skills and instincts that had made her one of the most feared operators in the world were still sharp, still deadly, and still ready to defend what mattered most: her home, her peace, and her right to live free from the wars she had already fought and won.